Wow, there's a little pop of color starting to bloom among the trees here in the capital region. Perfect timing as we kick off the autumnal equinox. On this episode of The Eagle, we'll go over this week's top stories.
That is just adding fuel to the fire of the racial reckoning that this country is facing over the course of this very difficult season.
We'll hear about a local school district scrambling to tighten virtual school protocols after students began crashing each other's lessons.
There were a few kinks to iron out. There are a few quirks this week.
And we'll learn about an extraordinary young man living in an Albany neighborhood that's stricken by gun violence.
But I still feel like everything is more than what you're born into.
This is The Eagle, a look inside our newsroom. I'm Jessica Marshall.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring in you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome to The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall. Let's start with a look at what appeared in the Times Union and on timesunion.com this week. We are here now with Times Union editor Casey Seiler, as we are every week, to go over the top headlines and give a little analysis about what's going on in the region. First up, we're going to talk about the trial of former Rensselaer County DA Joel Abelov. Something big just happened. Can you tell us about it?
Right. So we're talking Thursday afternoon. Joel Abelov, former Rensselaer County District Attorney, as you noted, one-termer, he was turned out of office, was on trial facing felony perjury charges and 2 counts of misdemeanor official misconduct. All of those charges related to his handling of the 2016 shooting death of Edson Thevenin at the hands of Troy City Police Sergeant during a DUI stop that led to a car chase that ended with Mr. Thevenin dead due to being shot by this officer. Joel Abelov, the district attorney, put that incident before a grand jury just 5 days after it occurred, at the same time that the state attorney general's office had made it clear to Abelov that they might be investigating the case because of Governor Cuomo's executive order that empowers the AG's office to investigate the deaths of unarmed civilians at the hands of police. Now, the accusation was that Joel Abelov rushed through this grand jury in an attempt to exonerate Sergeant Randall French, who was the shooter in this incident, and he also failed to get a waiver of immunity before bringing Randall French before that grand jury. That essentially meant that Joel Abelov had granted immunity to Randall French the minute he opened his mouth on the stand. That meant that there was no way the grand jury could ever have indicted Randall French. That was related to the charges of official misconduct. The perjury was related to Joel Abelov's own testimony in a subsequent grand jury that was called by the state AG's office to look into this matter. Abelov said, oh yeah, I had granted immunity to another police officer who had shot a guy in an earlier incident. And in fact, that had not happened. Abelov insisted that he had been given bad information and had made a mistake on the stand because of it. This was a bench trial, Jess, which meant that Abelov elected not to put his hands or his fate in the hands of a jury, but instead wanted it decided by a judge from Columbia County named Jonathan Nichols, who 2 years ago dismissed the charges against Joel Abelov, claiming that the state AG's office had overstepped its jurisdiction in doing it. So that decision, Jonathan Nichols' decision, had been overturned by a state appellate court. The Court of Appeals essentially upheld it by refusing to consider it. So Judge Nichols was sitting in judgment. He was the sole juror, as it were, of a case that he had 2 years ago dismissed in their entirety. So there is going to be a lot of talk about this outcome to the case the fact that the verdict came so swiftly. I think it was less than 2 hours from the end of closing arguments to the judge announcing his verdict. And of course, this is all coming the day after the Kentucky State Attorney General announced that only one officer would face charges in the incident that led to the death of Breonna Taylor. The acquittal of Joel Abelov, it's quite likely, could turn into another one of those incidents, such as the death of Daniel Prude and the subsequent cover-up of the investigation of that death, that is just adding fuel to the fire of the racial reckoning that this country is facing over the course of this very difficult season.
I'm sure we'll be keeping our eye on that going forward. And our very own Rob Gavin was covering the trial gavel to gavel, right?
Rob is our guy for gavel to gavel trial coverage. It takes a lot of focus. It's quite a marathon effort.
Speaking of Rob Gavin, though, that's a nice segue into the next topic here. He covered the NXIVM, Keith Raniere's trial back 2 years ago now, was it?
Year and a half, not even.
Yes. And Keith Raniere will be sentenced at the end of October. And of course, our sister podcast, NXIVM on Trial, go listen to that for all of the latest there. But what I did want to talk to you about was The Vow, the HBO documentary on sort of the NXIVM saga. And the Times-Union had kind of a starring role in this week's episode. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yes, well, The Vow is a very, very good documentary, of course. The first couple of episodes are really told from within the organization. And the frustration, of course, for many of us who have been following the saga of NXIVM for, more than a decade now, is that there is almost nothing about the sort of press attention that was devoted to NXIVM, especially by the Times-Union, in those first episodes. And what we finally got in, I believe we're talking about the 5th episode that just aired last Sunday and is, of course, now on demand, is that it did give propers to many of the reporters who covered NXIVM, not just at the Times-Union, but it made it clear that a series that ran in the Times-Union in the winter of 2012 called Secrets of NXIVM by Jim Odato and Jen Gish, which exposed beyond creepy behavior by Keith Raniere, of course, the man called Vanguard, the guru at the top of NXIVM, exploded within the organization like a bomb. However, Mark Vicente, who is sort of one of the two main characters in The Vow, said that he read all those stories which exposed disturbing interactions between extremely young women and Keith Raniere going back 2 decades prior to that he went to Raniere and he said Raniere had all the answers to kind of to knock down the allegations contained therein. But it's remarkable to me that there was so little attention given to those stories, not just within NXIVM. You can understand why the faithful might have turned away from, this terrible information, these awful allegations, but from law enforcement, not only in Saratoga County and Albany County, where NXIVM had so much of its operations, but also at the state level and even at the federal level. The allegations that were raised in Secrets of NXIVM were essentially a prologue to, in 2017 and 2018. And if more had been done then, the suffering that the women within NXIVM endured in the years after that could quite likely have been alleviated. But unfortunately, there was an insufficient law enforcement response to those allegations.
Now, I'm sure that this won't be the last that we'll hear of the Times-Union coverage in that series. So more to come on that for sure. Moving over to some more local news, the campaign of Albany Mayor Kathy Sheehan was kind of pilfered, I think is the right way to say it, recently by a local restaurateur. Can you describe more about what came out there?
Yeah, allegations and an arrest of Scott Solomon, who worked on the mayor's most recent campaign and is now charged with stealing more than $20,000, including through the use of a credit card that was taken out on behalf of the mayor's reelection campaign and that was apparently used for charges well beyond the political in nature. Mr. Solomon was one of the operators of Ciro's, the venerable trackside restaurant up in Saratoga Springs. His involvement apparently ended over the course of the summer, but a pretty remarkable story. I mean, politicians do not like to be taken for a ride by campaign officials, but allegedly that appeared to be the case in Mr. Solomon's prosecution.
Now, one last thing, moving up to the state level, there's a lot bubbling up around Governor Andrew Cuomo and the handling of nursing homes during the COVID pandemic. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of a look into what's going on there?
Yeah, the State Department of Health continues to stonewall on the release of data about nursing home residents who died not on the grounds of the nursing home, but who were shipped out to hospitals and then passed away. In July, the State Health Department issued what can only be described as a self-exonerating report that said that its March policy decision to require nursing homes to accept patients or not to turn patients away simply because of a COVID-19 diagnosis. The report from the health department looked only at the numbers of people who died in nursing homes and did not include the number of people who were nursing home residents who were shipped out to hospitals and then died. That, of course, in the eyes of critics, is a major data point that has been out really since the day that that report came out, almost 3 months ago now. You've heard critics, lawmakers of both parties at the Capitol clamoring for the health department to release that. Howard Zucker, the health commissioner, has said, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But people are growing increasingly frustrated. The Empire Center, which includes Bill Hammond, who's a former Daily News columnist, and he's their healthcare policy advocate. In the interest of full disclosure, I'll say he's a friend of mine as well, has sued, the Empire Center has sued for the release of that data. It's going to become increasingly hard for the administration to justify this kind of stonewalling, but it continues to this day.
Well, you can read about that and all of the other headlines that we discussed at timesunion.com. Casey, thank you so much for joining me again, and we'll check back in with you next week.
Jess, thanks a lot.
Local school districts are confronting a bit of an online learning curve this fall as they embrace full-time virtual school for many students. Teachers at Albany city schools in particular, they're getting a crash course on virtual classroom security after an 8th grader at Myers Middle School interrupted a 7th grade class at North Albany with some X-rated content. I connected with education reporter Rachel Silberstein to talk about that incident and some other headlines from local school districts this week. Can you just tell me what happened this week?
Students started off their first week of online classes this week, and it was really tense. We weren't sure it was going to work, but it worked well. They're having a significant amount of live instruction from their teachers who are broadcasting directly from the classroom. And so far, grades K through 12 have only had virtual classes, and they've done mostly like orientation to get a sense of how the virtual classroom works. And there were a few kinks to iron out. There were a few quirks this week. In the older grades in particular, we saw on the middle school level, there were kids exchanging Google Meet links. So even though Google Meet is considered a pretty secure platform to host online learning, kids will be kids, and they were sharing links with each other, popping into each other's classes, and in one case, sharing some very inappropriate adult content. So Albany City Schools had to sort of regroup and remind its teachers to, apparently he accessed this classroom through an external email account. So they had to remind teachers to not allow kids to enter the virtual classroom if don't have like a school email account. And then there were other things that they had to brush up on, like, I think a lot of teachers have varying levels of internet savviness, or technology savviness. So I think I think there was some professional training, but this is always kind of it's all new territory. So they're sort of figuring out exactly what they need to have like a functional classroom. So they're learning how to mute everybody, mute the entire class, or kick people out. And I think some teachers didn't know that they had control over when the meeting starts and meeting stops. Because I know last year there was like some concern about kids meeting in the Google Meet chat before the class started, and the schools wanted to exercise a little more control over that.
What's different about this year that maybe teachers aren't used to? I mean, they had to do this at the end of last year, right?
Last year, they pulled together some sort of online curriculum sort of on the spot and didn't have a lot of time to prepare. This time they had the whole summer to prepare, and they had an extensive curriculum. One thing that's different about this year is they're doing a lot more live instruction. I think a lot of the city schools like Albany didn't have a whole lot of teacher in front of the classroom and everyone's face is on the screen and kids can raise their hand. So it wasn't something that they really got to experience in real time. So this was really a week to do a little trial and error and see what works. Actually, in the younger grades, it was really cute. We saw a problem with parents interrupting the classroom. There were a lot of parents who were like, I went to the bathroom. What are you talking about? What page are we on? And so I think, when teachers realize that they have some controls about muting, their classes' microphones, it'll make things go a little smoother.
Doesn't that add like another dimension though? Because usually, when kids are in school and classrooms, parents aren't there and, they only really have their kid's word to go on what happens in the classroom. So now suddenly they have access to the classroom, so to speak. I mean, that's a whole new level of things, right?
That's another change we're seeing this year is that schools across the capital region are really trying to tweak their curriculum and their technologies to ensure that parents have more seamless access to the classroom and the work that their child is doing without like disrupting it or intervening. So they can view it through their own login. But for younger grades, it's always going to be tricky just because if they're learning virtually and a good portion of younger children have elected to do the virtual option in Albany, they're going to need some parental support.
Albany School District is going through some rough things. They're facing some layoffs, right? Can you talk more about that?
Oh, yeah. So that has been really just heartbreaking to watch, because of obviously the state's being squeezed. They are facing a massive, multi-billion-dollar shortfall that's sort of rolling onto state aid payments. The state in July and August rolled back state aid payments 20%. For this month, they have said they will pay. I think they were facing some support, some sort of pushback from parents and activists and unions. NYSIT filed legal action against the state for reducing those payments across the board because, of course, when payments are reduced by 20%, it's going to disproportionately affect city school districts, high needs districts, usually communities of color, which rely on a lot more state aid to cover their operating costs. I think Friday is the last day for like more than 200 teachers, support staff, school psychologists, principals, and it's been really heartbreaking. A lot of parents are saying like their kids are devastated. They really were bonded with these administrators. And we're seeing some people move around. We saw, there were some problems at Myers Middle School. The building wasn't quite ready. They had some construction issues over the summer. There was a flood, and because schools were closed, they didn't catch it until the whole sort of mold sort of took over the building. So they had to sort of do a lot of mold abatement. And so, those kids are actually lucky they get to be in the brand new Albany High School building. But they lost their principal, and so they're really looking at a lot of changes, and I think that's going to be a little bit difficult because a lot of their principal, who they were really close to, and the teachers really had a good rapport with, had to transfer because of this reduction in staff. So we're seeing a lot of that, and so that's also another component of this adjustment period.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. I guess the last thing that I wanted to touch on is, well, COVID. I mean, that's woven into everything that we've discussed already. But we're seeing headlines every day. Like Shen had, a positive COVID case. Niskayuna has a positive COVID case. Like, what are you kind of seeing in your reporting that's coming up when these cases come out? And what is your sense of what's going to happen, I guess?
Except in the case in Mohannesson, that where it actually shut down the school, for the most part, they occur during like training sessions. So they were caught before students were in the building, and they were able to contact trace and manage the situation. The state, in the meantime, has put out a COVID-19 report card online where parents can actually log in and find out exactly how many cases have been at their school. But we're seeing, similar to the colleges, we're seeing like one case pop up here, really an isolated case where it's a manageable situation. But I think everyone's a little on edge, and they know that there's always the possibility that this could end in a second if there's an outbreak or there's more than 2 or 3 cases, and it seems like it warrants shutting down the building. But so far so good, people are... I think we're all hopeful that this is going to last.
A lot of these technology issues that are coming up, they're not just exclusive to, the teachers learning how to use these platforms. It's also brought up a lot of issues with privacy rights for students and, things that might go on in students' homes while they're on the meets and recording the calls. There's like a whole slew of issues. So can you sort of sum that up?
I think my next story that I'm working on is I'm talking to the state ed department, because I think as, more schools are getting online and actually starting the school year, they're going to sort of tighten their privacy rules and guidelines in terms of how these Google Meets happen. Of course, when there are children are encouraged to turn their cameras on so they can participate in the classroom. But of course, that shows their home, and it does sort of intrude on their privacy on some level. These classes are also recorded, so they're downloadable, and that might make kids self-conscious. So they're trying to find ways. I think Google Meet rolled out some privacy measures so that kids could blur their backgrounds. Or if they're self-conscious about their homes, kids are self-conscious and they might not want all their classmates to see inside their home or what's happening there. So I think that's something that state education officials are still trying to work out, figuring out how to ensure that kids have their privacy protected, and also making sure that this content is encrypted and protected safely, and that Google isn't tracking their students' data or using it in a way that's not great. So that's something that's, to be determined.
After the break, a young man finds his way, living in one of Albany's most dangerous neighborhoods.
Hi, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union. Join us for an ongoing discussion on major developments in the saga of Keith Raniere, co-founder of NXIVM, the shadowy upstate New York organization at the center of the explosive federal investigation that resulted in his conviction on charges of extortion, sex trafficking, and more. We talk to former members of NXIVM, discuss the latest news, and preview the likely next twists in this bizarre and disturbing story. You can find NXIVM on Trial at timesunion.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome to The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall. Every day, 19-year-old Zanief Washington takes a walk around Albany. He walks for hours, traversing the city. He doesn't do it for exercise or for fun. He does it to escape the Arbor Hill neighborhood where he's lived most of his life, a neighborhood that has seen a major spike in gun violence this year. Reporter Eduardo Medina recently had a chance to join the young man on one of his daily perambulations, and he wrote a story about how Zanief's experiences have shaped his outlook on life.
I'ma be real with you. I'm starting to lose my damn mind. They told me I gotta go take it slow. That's how I blow up my grind.
Tell me about Zanief Washington. What is he like? What's his personality? What are his likes and dislikes? Tell me all about him.
Yeah, sure. So Zanief Washington, he is a 19-year-old kid who lives on First Street. He's an aspiring musician and an aspiring photographer, an aspiring artist overall. He's a really nerdy guy. He's into Dragon Ball Z. and Naruto, this show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. He likes comic books, and so he's this really nerdy kid who's into music, and not only is he into music and on a surface level, but he's pursuing that path as a possible profession for him.
I'ma be real with you. I'm starting to lose my damn mind. They told me I gotta go take it slow. That's how I roll up my grind. Got so much shit I be thinking.
What kind of music does he make?
Yeah, so he makes hip hop. He raps in his songs. His most well-known song is a song called Hide and Seek.
Looking for handouts, I work for myself. Looking back at it, I made some mistakes. It's okay because I'm getting closer to wealth. Ain't no corny shit.
He performed that song last year at this festival called Rocktoberfest. He only performed that one song, so it was this like adrenaline rush. For 3 minutes, he was just performing this song that he'd written to people. He's really into hip hop. I asked him his top 5 artists. I remember his first 2. He loves Andre 3000 and he loves Omarion. And he's really passionate about it. He loves old school hip hop too. 50 Cent, he's really into 50 Cent, but that's his thing. Yeah.
I don't know if people would argue that 50 Cent is old school hip hop.
I know, right?
That's funny. Now tell me, how did you meet him?
There were some layers to how I met him. So first I reached out to Dr. Alice Green, who was a prominent activist and leader here in Albany. And so I told her what kind of story that I was trying to do. And the story that I pitched to her that I wanted to do was write about a kid who is living amongst these shootings and living in these neighborhoods where there's a lot of poverty, and write about a kid who's doing all the right things on paper and just trying to make it by and do his thing or her thing at the time. And she led me to this nonprofit worker. His name is Paul. Paul told me about these 3 different young men that he knew that were doing good things in tough circumstances. And Zanief was particularly interesting to me just because of, he told me that he always went on walks every day and that he was always trying to leave his house. And that to me seemed interesting just because that would provide a lot of movement to the story. And then I drove to Zanief's home and I met him, and we instantly talked about Avatar: The Last Airbender and top 5 artists, hip hop artists, and went from there.
I was in my room just watching TV. All I hear is like a whole bunch of popping sounds, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, they're lighting fireworks again. But then I realized that like there's people outside like arguing and screaming and all that, and I'm like, oh, what's going on? I don't want to go outside. I don't want to go outside because I don't want to risk nothing.
He lives in a street that's seen 8 shootings so far this year. His house has been struck by stray bullets. He's lived there for 13 years, and I would ask him for specific incidents, and there were, he remember the first time, the last time, but everything in between, it was kind of a blur because it's happened more often than he'd like.
Like I said, I lived around it so much. It's just like I can't distinctly tell one apart from another. It's
that makes sense.
It's just
it's like it's another one. Why would you remember that?
It's another one. Why do I care? It just happens.
He's had gun violence affect his family as well.
Yeah, so that was really interesting when I talked to his mom and him about it. This didn't come after the first interview. This came after a couple of days. I think that I was starting to get his trust more and more. But he shared with me that on the day he was born, his cousin was being buried that day because Shondell Smith was killed by a stray bullet. And so his mom was giving birth to Zanief, and at the same time, Zanief's cousin was being buried. And so, from day one, obviously he didn't know about that, but, that was involved in his life. And then at age 6, he remembers that was the first time he discovered what a gunshot sounded like, because he was playing Spider-Man 3 in his living room. And then all of a sudden, the living room window was shattered by a bullet, and it left a hole in his living room. And from there, it's just been this constant force in his life.
I just wanted to stop. I was just annoyed. I'm not even upset. I'm not sad.
Right.
I'm just annoyed. And I'm numb to it. I shouldn't be numb to that. No child should be numb to hearing bullets every single night.
Now that he's 19 and he's in this in-between period of not being in high school and not being in college anymore, he's kind of in this strange transitionary times where every day he leaves his house for most of the day to try to leave his neighborhood. And he goes on walks. That's why he goes on walks, to leave. I mean, he enjoys them, but he doesn't want to stay there. And he talks about wanting to leave and getting an apartment closer to downtown, which is just a 20-minute walk away. It's a huge disparity when you go on these walks with him.
You literally went on walks with him all day, right?
Yeah, so the first 4 days of me being with him were just kind of interview days where I talked to him for an hour or two, or sometimes 3 hours. And then the last 4 days, I stuck with him from like 1 p.m., which is when he is waking up recently, till about 8 or 9 p.m. For those hours, he was walking around. And so I followed him, and I would see the things he was seeing.
That's just life. You know, everything is, but I still feel like everything is more than what you're born into. Mm-hmm. You can still figure out a way out while you're doing whatever it is that's not right.
Right.
You're just using that as means for survival. That's not really who you are. You're just in that circumstance. And I feel like a lot of people are in that situation right now.
You know, there's one scene in the story where he's walking back home and he sees a man crossing the street, and then the car gets really up close to the man, and the man yells out like, hit me. And it's this really tense moment, and Zanief is kind of glancing his eyes over there, and he mutters, oh my God. And he, in person, seeing it was really tense, because Zanief had talked about how there are disputes, and these disputes sometimes lead to incidents, to violence, sometimes shootings, you know, who knows that one. And so this is happening, and then it de-escalates. You know, the car drives off, and the man keeps walking, and Zanief keeps walking, and I'm following Zanief. And the man who had yelled, hit me, who was very agitated, his backdrop is just this row of dilapidated houses. And so you see how, like, the environment that this man is walking in, that I hope paints a clear picture of, you know, it's not just blind rage that's leading to the incidents. There's a lot of factors that go into these shootings.
It's a systemic problem.
Yeah.
What do you want people to take away from this story?
That's such a good question. I hope the story is gives the effect of like you looking through a window and just seeing what this young man sees every day. I hope the story offers some clarity in a really complex issue, and you know, I hope the story humanizes and makes people empathize with people who are in the middle of a really crazy year. There's a pandemic, there's an increase in shootings, there's a lot of economic turmoil, and there's protests for racial equality, and these neighborhoods are majority Black. And so, you know, I don't think the story tries to answer any of these issues. I hope it just tells a story of how all these issues intersect, and how they're intersecting and changing and transforming this one young man's life. And who knows, you know, if for the better or for the good, but it's certainly affecting him.
Well, it's a beautifully written story. I highly encourage everyone to go to timesunion.com and check it out. That's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. We'll be back next week with another look inside the newsroom here at the Times-Union. In the meantime, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, or head over to timesunion.com for the latest news and features.